Welcome to the debate. When you scan a barcode on an apple at the grocery store, a computer basically tells you everything, right? Exactly where it was planted, the day it was packed, transit time, cost.
Right. The modern supply chain makes the logistics perfectly visible. I mean, the system tracks the external journey without missing a single beat.
Yeah, exactly. But then you walk over to the produce bins and you stare at this mountain of massive watermelons, and suddenly all that digital tracking is, well, it's completely useless.
Oh, totally. It really is the ultimate consumer gamble. You're just staring at this giant green sphere, risking $8 or $10 and hoping the inside isn't, pale, mealy, and destined straight for the compost bin.
Right. You're flying completely blind. So today, we are looking at the agricultural heuristics used to determine fruit ripeness. Specifically, we're digging into the 7-point Amish watermelon testing method.
Which is essentially reading the physical markers left on a fruit, right? Things like the field spot, the texture, acoustic resonance, the weight.
Exactly. And the central question we are tackling today is this. Do these traditional tests represent a set of objectively legible biological markers that any consumer can pick up and use? Or
Are they actually a highly subjective, culturally transmitted sensory art that relies basically entirely on a lifetime of experiential baselines?
right. And I look at this whole system as a rigorous scientific diagnostic framework. People treat it like quaint folk wisdom, but it's really about reading absolute biological fingerprints. I mean, the sun, the vine, the bees, they all leave markers that directly correlate to the internal chemistry of the fruit.
Well, the theory behind the method is definitely rooted in biology. Sure, the plant obviously goes through real chemical changes, but the actual execution of these tests, that is an entirely subjective, culturally inherited art form.
I completely disagree.
Hear me out. Telling an inexperienced shopper to walk into a store and accurately execute these sensory evaluations, it completely resists the simple, 90-second codification the material claims it has.
Let's break down why these markers aren't just subjective feelings, though. Let's start with the primary visual filter. If you walk up to a bin, the absolute foundation of the method is checking the field spot.
Right, the underbelly.
Yeah, the one place on the melon that rested on the soil, totally untouched by the sun or the ambient air. When a melon is unripe, that spot is white or green, but when it turns a buttery, deep yellow, you are looking at direct chemical evidence.
You are talking about the breakdown of chlorophyll, obviously.
Exactly. The chlorophyll in the rind degrades, and the carotenoids, the yellow pigments, develop. But that chemical reaction takes time, right?
Sure.
And it only completes if the fruit is left on the vine to soak up the residual heat of the sun-warmed earth. So, a white spot objectively proves premature harvesting. It is a binary diagnostic. White means immature chemistry, deep yellow means mature chemistry.
I'll give you that. The field spot is easily the most objective visual cue in the entire framework. I mean, I won't argue the basic chemistry of carotenoids with you.
Thank you.
But, and this is a big but, this system quickly falls apart when you try to apply the rest of it in a modern context. Take the very next test in the sequence, checking the stem and the tendril for dryness.
Which is a great indicator.
It is in theory. The material notes that a dry brown tendril indicates the plant mechanically halted sap production.
Right, which means the plant effectively severed its own connection to the fruit because the seed maturation process was complete. It's brilliant.
It is brilliant. But look at the reality of the supply chain. The source material itself admits that modern grocery stores almost always cut the stems extremely short. And the tendrils? They're entirely gone. Do you know why packers do that?
Well, it's a spatial efficiency practice for shipping.
It's spatial, sure, but it's mostly damage control. A watermelon bin holds maybe 60 to 80 melons. If they leave dry, stiff, woody stems attached, the vibration of a semi-truck driving 1,000 miles causes those stems to just gouge the rinds of neighboring melons.
Which leads to bacterial infection.
Exactly. Infection and rot. So packers shear them off flush. The tendril is a fantastic data point if you are standing in a dirt field. But for the vast majority of modern consumers, that biological marker has been physically erased by logistics before the fruit even hits the shelf.
Okay, fair. The supply chain absolutely modifies the presentation, but removing one data point doesn't invalidate the metric where it can be found. And, even without the tendril, we have other purely visual records.
Like what?
Specifically, the shape and the webbing. This is where the underlying science of the framework is incredibly elegant. I look at the webbing on a melon's rind not as folklore, but as a botanical ledger.
A ledger. Wait, you mean the brown scarring on the skin?
Yes, the source refers to them as sugar lines, but biologically, it is a literal tally of bee visits. When a bee lands on a flower to pollinate it, it leaves a microabrasion.
Oh, I see where you're going.
Right? That abrasion heals into a brown scar. But here is the mechanism that makes it the diagnostic. A watermelon flower needs multiple bee visits, usually like 8 to 10, for full pollination. Each time a bee deposits pollen, it fertilizes a specific ovule, which becomes a seed.
And the fertilization triggers the hormonal response.
Precisely. That specific fertilization triggers the plant to produce auxins, growth hormones, in that exact localized segment of the fruit. Think of the bee scar as a trigger for a microscopic vascular highway.
A highway for the sugars.
Exactly. The auxins literally build the internal plumbing that pulls water and dissolved sugars to that specific side of the melon. So if pollen is deposited evenly by a high frequency of bee visits, the plant draws nutrients symmetrically to all sides.
So an asymmetrical, lumpy melon is essentially a physical map showing a lack of pollination on one side.
Yes, exactly. One side got no pollen, so it got no auxins, and it built no plumbing to draw sugar. The webbing and the symmetry guarantee an even sugar distribution. This moves the test completely out of the realm of sensory guesswork. You are reading the accounting book of the local bee population.
Okay, I admit the localized auxin distribution is fascinating, and I don't dispute the mechanics of the vascular highway. But my contention is with the visual legibility of that ledger to an untrained eye.
What do you mean? It's right there on the skin.
You tell a modern consumer to look for brown sugar lines, and what actually happens in the produce aisle? They end up staring at a melon, squinting, trying to figure out if they are looking at a legitimate pollination scar or just transport damage from rubbing against a cardboard bin.
Although the webbing has a very distinct, raised, scabby texture compared to a flat friction bruise, it's pretty obvious if you just feel it.
Obvious to a grandmother who has evaluated 10,000 melons in her lifetime. To the person who just wants a decent dessert for a Saturday barbecue, those visual nuances blur together.
I think you're underestimating people.
I don't think I am. Is it a sugar line? Is it damage from a cucumber beetle? Is it a minor fungal spot? The objective biological marker exists, yes, but the ability to read that marker is highly subjective.
But that is exactly why the method is structured as a composite check. You don't buy a melon based on one scar. If you misread a beetle scratch as a sugar line, you still have the field spot to back you up.
Okay, surface markers are one thing, but the field spot and the webbing only tell us about the exterior history. How does the yellow spot guarantee the inside isn't a mealy disaster?
Because the external markers correlate to the internal.
That's where your system forces consumers to start knocking on fruit like they're looking for a secret door. We have to talk about the physical tests, the tactile and auditory markers, the thump and the weight.
The thump is probably the most famous piece of produce lore in existence, and the underlying physics of it are entirely sound. Human beings are incredibly adept at interpreting acoustic resonance.
Are we, though?
Absolutely. We intuitively understand the difference between tapping a solid block of wood and tapping a hollow drum.
Sure, but the framework asks the consumer to distinguish between three very specific acoustic signatures: a barrel half full of water, which indicates ripe, a solid wood thud, which means unripe, and a mushy pillow sound, which means overripe.
Right, and think about the material science of what is happening inside that rind to create those distinct sounds. A watermelon is 90% water by weight.
Yeah.
When it is unripe, the pectin, which acts as this kind of botanical cement holding the cellular structure together, is extremely rigid. The internal architecture is tight and dense.
Because all that water is tightly bound within those rigid cell walls.
Exactly. So if you strike it, the sound waves travel very quickly through a dense, solid medium that produces a high-frequency, dull thud, the solid wood sound.
Okay.
But as the melon ripens, Pectinase enzymes begin to break down that botanical cement. The cellular matrix literally softens. The water releases into the intercellular spaces, the sugars dissolve, and the interior essentially transitions into a fluid-filled resonant chamber.
And the change in internal density drops the frequency.
Yes! When you strike it after that chemical phase change, the acoustic signature fundamentally drops. You get a lower frequency, a deep, hollow boom. It is basic acoustic physics reflecting the action of pectinase enzymes.
You say it's just basic physics, but human ears aren't oscilloscopes. I completely agree that the phase change alters the frequency. But without an experiential baseline, the word hollow means absolutely nothing to someone standing in a noisy grocery store aisle.
You can still hear the difference.
With pop music? Playing overhead? Come on! If you have never struck a perfectly ripe melon to know what the baseline water barrel sounds like, you have no reference point for the high or low frequencies. Well, you don't necessarily need a perfect historical baseline. You can establish a localized baseline just by tapping 3 or 4 melons right there in the bin. You will hear the variation. Will you? Because that localized comparison relies entirely on the assumption that there is a ripe melon in the bin to provide the correct acoustic signature in the first place. Usually there is at least one.
Not always. And that brings us to the weight test, which suffers from the exact same flaw of relativity.
The weight test is straightforward. Water is dense. A melon that was picked early and hasn't developed fully, or one that has dehydrated, will be less dense.
Right.
The method advises you to pick up 2 melons of roughly the same size and keep the one that feels heavier. The heavier one contains more water and dissolves sugar per cubic inch.
The density correlation is factual, I'll give you that. But consider the reality of grocery store economics. The source material explicitly acknowledges that supermarkets prefer to sell you a pale, unripe melon rather than let inventory rot in the back room.
Well, yeah, because a fully ripe melon might only have a few days of shelf life before it turns to mush, whereas an unripe one can survive the cold chain logistics for weeks.
Exactly. They actively prioritize shelf life over ripeness. The buyers purposely spec for underripe fruit to survive the warehouse-to-store distribution delay.
Sure, that's true.
So, if a supermarket bin is completely filled with melons that were picked a week too early, which is a highly probable scenario, your comparative weight test completely fails.
How does it fail? The denser one is still mathematically superior.
Because you are just finding the best of a bad batch. You heft 2 unripe melons, and you determine which of the 2 unripe melons is marginally denser.
But it's still the better choice.
If the entire sample size is compromised by premature harvesting, the localized comparative test yields a false positive. You aren't finding a ripe melon. To do this correctly, you need a historical internal baseline of what a 10-pound ripe melon should feel like, not just a comparison between 2 bad options in front of you.
Okay, I see the vulnerability in a localized comparison of the whole bin is literally garbage. But that is exactly why the brilliance of the system lies in its algorithmic nature. It is a biological algorithm designed specifically to filter out bad batches.
Wait, you're calling a grandmother's fruit picking habit an algorithm?
Yes, because it functions exactly like one. It is a 90-second checklist that utilizes multiple intersecting fail-safes. You do not rely solely on the thump or solely on the comparative weight. You run the sequence.
A sequence which starts with the spot.
Right. You filter first by the visual absolute, the buttery yellow spot. If the whole bin is full of prematurely harvested shelf-stable melons with white spots, the algorithm tells you to walk away immediately.
So the comparative weight test never even happens.
You check the visual ledger of the webbing to ensure even pollination.
Assuming you can read the ledger.
Assuming you can read it, yes. Then you confirm the internal pectin breakdown with the acoustic thump. And finally, you use the comparative weight as a tiebreaker between 2 strong biologically mature candidates.
It sounds nice in theory.
It's a systematic elimination of bad produce. It doesn't require decades of sensory art. It requires the discipline to actually run the biological checklist.
Look, if it's merely a strict, executable checklist, then your own source material reveals a profound contradiction. On one hand, it claims that any consumer can learn this whole set in 15 minutes.
They can.
But almost in the same breath, it laments that this specific knowledge slowly stopped being passed down from grandmother to mother and mother to daughter. Why would a simple checklist die out?
Knowledge is frequently lost simply when it isn't culturally valued anymore, not necessarily because it is technically complex. I mean, the stores certainly have no financial incentive to teach you how to reject their underripe inventory.
True, the stores aren't printing this on the sides of the bins, but the real reason this method fades from families is because it is an experiential language. It's an inherited sensory vocabulary.
I still say it's objective data.
The source specifically mentions that to truly learn this, you have to go home, cut open the melon on a Saturday afternoon, and let your family taste the deep red, dense, sugar-sweet flesh.
Which validates the successful execution of the checklist.
No, the tasting isn't just validation. It is the critical feedback loop. That is how you calibrate your senses for the next trip. If you don't experience the reward of the correct sensory input, the taste of the sugars, the auxins directed, the texture of the broken down pectin, the hollow boom means absolutely nothing. When the grandmother tapped the melon, she wasn't running an abstract algorithm. She was accessing decades of successful and unsuccessful feedback loops. It is a learned calibration, an art form cultivated over time, not a downloadable 90-second flowchart you can master on your first try.
You know, I think that's a fair distinction. The tasting provides a necessary feedback loop to calibrate the user to the instrument.
Exactly.
If you diagnose a mechanical issue in a car engine based on a rattling sound, actually taking the engine apart and fixing the loose belt confirms you interpreted the acoustic signature correctly. But the underlying markers, the loose belt in the engine, or the dissolved pectin in the fruit, remain objective physical phenomena.
They do exist, yes.
The earth, the sun, the vine, and the bees genuinely leave physical fingerprints on the fruit. The Amish 7-test method is a remarkable and empirically sound framework for reading those environmental inputs. It translates the hidden chemical composition of a plant into legible, physical data points that we can measure with our eyes, hands, and ears.
And while those physical markers undeniably exist in the biology of the plant, interpreting them correctly in a sterile supermarket aisle is a highly nuanced sensory skill. The fact that modern consumers struggle to distinguish a heavy melon from a light one, or a hollow boom from a solid thud, highlights a profound disconnect between us and the agricultural realities of our food.
We definitely agree on that disconnect.
Right. The biological markers are objective, but the reading of them is an experiential art we have largely forgotten.
Yet, despite that disconnect, I think we both clearly acknowledge a vital piece of shared ground here. Whether you view the sequence as a strict scientific algorithm or a culturally calibrated sensory art, this traditional method of evaluation is vastly superior to what most people do today.
Oh, absolutely. Walking up to a bin and simply picking the biggest melon with the clearest, most pristine green rind, which ironically often means it's unripe and lacked the bee visits to fully pollinate, is just a recipe for disappointment.
It's the worst way to do it.
These traditional tests, at the very least, empower consumers to stop relying on blind luck. They force you to start paying attention to the material reality of what you are buying, and they give you the tools to reject substandard prematurely harvested produce.
Yeah, it forces us to slow down. It demands that we pay close, multidisciplinary attention to the natural world. There is so much more to explore regarding how we evaluate the hidden quality of the food we consume, far beyond what a printed barcode or a digital inventory system can tell us.
It leaves the listener with a choice, really. You have to decide if you can simply memorize the checklist and execute it flawlessly on your next grocery run, or if you need to accept that you are embarking on a long-term journey to build your own sensory database. Calibrating your ear one hollow boom and solid thud at a time.
So the next time you are standing under the fluorescent lights of the produce aisle, staring at that mountain of green rinds, remember that you don't have to rely entirely on the digital certainty of the supply chain. The biological history of that fruit, the sun it absorbed, the water it held, and the bees that visited it is written right there on its surface, just waiting to be read.